Dr. Carol Queen is a pioneering sexologist, educator, writer, and activist, celebrated for her trailblazing contributions to the field of sexual health and pleasure. With decades of experience in research, public speaking, and sex-positive activism, she has been instrumental in reshaping how society views and discusses sexuality. Dr. Queen's work blends scientific insight with real-life narratives, empowering individuals to embrace their desires and explore their sexual identities without judgment. As a respected voice in the movement towards inclusivity and open dialogue about sex, she continues to challenge taboos and inspire communities to redefine intimacy, communication, and pleasure in modern culture. The focus in all Dr. Queen does is to empower and inspire others to discover their own unique sexual profile. Finally, and I have to mention this, I think Carol also holds a position I think might well be unique as a curator of the Good Vibrations Antique Vibrator Museum. Who knew such a thing existed? You're very, very welcome. Both you and your cat are very welcome to join us today. My dog's here, so you may hear some chatting backwards and forwards to the cat as we go along. I want to really just start by asking about your formative years. Can you pinpoint anything as you were growing up that connects to your career and the direction that you've decided to take?
Well, I can, in fact, I can pinpoint a couple of things, I think. One of them is that to start out with, I grew up in the country. My father was an elementary school teacher. My mother, for quite some time, was a stay-at-home mom, and then she was a bookkeeper and went out to work at a certain point after my brother and I went to school. And so we were pretty isolated in many ways, and that was one way of joining the world, but it wasn't always a really easy one, right? It wasn't necessarily a way to get integrated into the outside world as it existed then in the early and middle 60s. I was very interested in what was going on in the 60s. Lots going on, as you may recall. As a young girl, I would read magazines and think this outside world is not the outside world that I know at all. So I began to sort of grow in my pot differently, maybe would be if I'd been a flower, which perhaps I was. And the other thing, though, is that post World War II, dads and moms, sometimes they had rough times, and there was something about my house. There was something about their relationship. I didn't know anything about relationships. I didn't know anything about that. And it wasn't until after my dad died, when I was in my late 20s, that my mother told me that she'd been sexually abused when she was a child by a family member. And she had not told him until the perpetrator had died, just a very few years before. And she had never gotten any kind of support about it. I think probably she'd not told anyone. She'd tried to see it through all on her own without enough skill. And I thought to myself, having already determined for myself that sex was profoundly important in some way or many ways, embarked on the path of figuring out what that meant to me. I sat there during this conversation thinking, well, that explains a lot. And with this wash of sadness and sorrow for her, because I had built a life by then where I could talk about sexuality, or at least sexual orientation, for heaven's sake, sexual diversity, things like that. Already built a life where that was easy for me to do, pretty much. And I was a public speaker. I co-founded one of the very first gay youth groups in the United States with a couple gay boys that I met when they were teens, and I was just in college. And she had none of that. She couldn't even speak to her partner. We used to go visit the perpetrator and his family on vacations. And it just, even today, the enormity of that is just a little more than I can wrap my brain around, because I wasn't a heterosexual woman growing up in a sexually silenced time. but she was, at least I think she was heterosexual. Who knows? It's
Yeah.
too late to know, right? So that's the tidbit, and and what I implied about doing my own research. I don't think I used that term, but that's what it was in many ways. Was that I started being sexually active by the time I was 15. I was If you don't experience good sex, you experience information. That doesn't, I don't think that excuses anything non-consensual. Let me just be really clear
Yeah.
about that. But I do know that we don't learn about sex enough to go out, most of us, and certainly then, to have it with the kind of joy that it can bring. And so it was important to me to try to figure out what all of this was about, because I had determined that maybe I determined this was my path. Maybe I was just working out the energy that I felt in my family. Not even sure to this day, but I know that that was important. And it certainly led me to be a sexologist. I'm not recommending that all the young people go out and learn it in the gutter. I'm not recommending that at all. I'm recommending better sex education and better communication about all of this, is really what I'm recommending. But since I didn't have that, I just went ahead.
It's interesting you talked about education there for a second, and I have a view that the education that is currently offered in the UK and I know across the US on sex, intimacy, sexuality is woefully inadequate. And as a result, people will look for information, if they look at all, in perhaps inappropriate places. They dive into porn very early, or they expect that to explain to them what intimacy is all about, which it doesn't. What do you think good education looks like? And I guess not only for children and teens, but there are many adults who still see sex as somehow something that's dirty or perhaps to be endured as opposed to enjoyed. How should education be, do you think?
Well, I want to start by saying that it's really, I'm not an anti-porn person by any means, but porn is not sex education. It's a form of cultural product, and
Hmm.
it's influenced by all kinds of things. And if people listening don't think, gosh, what might it be influenced by, are those things I want to be influenced by, I would encourage them to think those thoughts. And if they haven't thought the same about television commercials and the evening news, I would encourage them to think those thoughts about that as well, because one of the most extraordinary tools for us to try to get around this so far not very good or downright terrible or offensive or toxic education that many of us have been exposed to is media literacy. Because
Hmm.
one of the primary ways, I started a nonprofit called the Center for Sex and Culture. And the reason that it has that name is because I'm thoroughly convinced that most of us, most adults, most youth, try to understand sex vis-a-vis cultural products. We watch porn, we read books, we watch rom-coms, we look at
Hmm.
deodorant commercials, we Viagra commercials, a lot of those. And all of those are laying layers in our minds, right? Our assumptions. And I talked about growing up fairly isolated. One of the things that did to serve me was it allowed me to avoid some of those layers as they were being laid down more thickly in young people who were in the thick of things.
Hmm.
It gave me a little more independence, I think. And so people need to ask themselves where their independence might come from as far as these things are concerned, because the opposite, not useful product of not looking at any of this sexual cultural material at all, no porn, ignore the rom-coms, all of that, is somebody in your world's going to try to tell you what you should believe. And of course, the United States is embarking on a scorched earth version of this notion right now. Yesterday, the news that the Smithsonian is being investigated for inappropriate
I saw that.
collections.
Yeah.
That's if that isn't ringing alarm bells to everyone in the democratic world, or so-called democratic world, um, it should be. And so education needs to include anatomy. It needs to include diverse desires and different ways of thinking about what role sex can play in the life of an individual. As we're thinking about that, we have to think about bodily autonomy and consent,
Mhm.
because of course, just because we desire something and are in the same room with another person is not a definition of consent, although many people appear to believe that it is. And well, if they didn't want to do it, they would have left, wouldn't they? Oh please, oh please, it is to laugh, except it's not. And so that's important. One of the things that sex ed in the U.S. has tried to do in my lifetime, and certainly still to the degree that it exists, is try to educate young people about the dangers and potential damages of sex. Not
Mhm.
irrelevant, especially during a time when people catch viruses, etc., from one another, and the government doesn't always seem to prioritize thinking about that very hard. And
Yeah.
a time when, in the United States at least, it's gotten harder and harder and harder to get reproductive care.
Mm.
So for some people at least, that's going to be bullseye relevant to whether or not they can have sex safely under almost any circumstances, except same gender and so on. So as I learned in my sexology program in San Francisco in the late 1980s, which those of you who are looking at your calendars will know it was the flaming height of the AIDS years. Uh, Harm reduction is extremely important, as my professor then put it. Anything worth doing is worth doing badly, meaning at least you try, at least you think in terms of, how could I mitigate any problem? Let's go for the pleasure, let's go for the connection, let's go for the desire that we're trying to act out here, and how do we forestall issues? Everybody should be thinking about that themselves, but also learning about what it means to even need to do that. And also, they possibly might want to think, why didn't they teach me this in school? Because communication is extremely important to what I've just talked about, of course. If you can't negotiate or determine common desires with somebody that you might be sexual with, whether you're in a lifelong monogamous relationship, or they just showed up and the time was right, then we can't guarantee that all that harm that I just referenced will back to the the top seats and not bother us while we're on the stage. So I just want people to have all of that. Well, I said anatomy. Let me just say clitoris while I'm talking about anatomy, just in case this is the first time that any of your listeners have heard that term and want to have it integrated into this whole set of issues, because not understanding the way a little over half the population is likely to get most aroused is a ridiculous gap in our knowledge. I talk to people about this and say, so the clitoris is homologous with the head of the penis, which is generally thought of as the most sensitive part of the penis, and pretty much the most sensitive area on the body of a person with a penis. They're essentially the same organ in many ways, and functionally they grow from the exact same tissue. And if we asked people with penises to pleasure themselves by moving their hand a couple of inches away from the penis, it would slow everything down quite a lot, and that could be good. But it wouldn't be the same experience that many people have today. And so the orgasm gap, so arousal as a necessity for orgasm, and in many, many cases, a necessity for pleasure at all. The fact that you use the word endured, that it doesn't have to be endured. If there's something that communication and interaction cannot fix, time cannot fix, i.e., taking some time for arousal building activities, then there might be something that a sex positive doctor could help fix. So
Hmm.
I want sex ed to get packed up with those ideas, starting at an appropriate age where we're not talking about the orgasms yet, et cetera, but we set it out in steps, and after someone has climbed the steps, they're equipped to step away into adulthood and decisions about their own pleasure that will serve them, and that they don't have to go groping around like I did to find answers to. Thank goodness I had some books to go with my groping. It helped me put some things into perspective.
And that's interesting. I think, and talking about pleasure as opposed to talking about sex, I think is a really good way of looking at it. And I think one of the big things that I've learned recently talking to people is the lack of time that individuals spend exploring their own bodies. And I think most of us, our first sexual activity is typically masturbation. We typically masturbate. I've got a feeling, oh, it feels good. Okay, that's great. But generally, when we're just going into puberty, it's generally fairly hurried. We fear parents going to come up the stairs or the door handle is suddenly going to switch, and we hear about it in negative terms of if you keep doing that, you'll go blind. But I think almost before we can confidently explore with somebody else, surely it's important to be able to explore our own sensations, feelings, what we enjoy. I just wondered how important you thought it was that we feel free to touch ourselves, explore without feeling any shame.
Well, I think it's fundamental, and and for so many different reasons, and you touched on many of them as you spoke. It is a way we learn. One of the most common misapprehensions about sex that I hear people express, both at good vibrations, in the
Hmm.
floor with a wall full of vibrators that we're looking at together, or in other kinds of contexts, is the idea that there's a normative way to experience sex and touch and pleasure and all of that. It's, this normativity, it's pretty binary, of course, whether people all are or not. And it's a way that encourages us to judge ourselves against others, i.e., the notion of others that we have in our head, because we don't walk around asking everybody how their sex life is and what they do. It would be an interesting world if we did. There are some subcultures that have
Hmm.
gotten fairly far into that practice, and it is very interesting.
Yeah.
Not always the best, but sometimes extraordinary. And we would we would understand and respect better if we got the encouragement to understand this, that not everybody feels the same feelings or has preferences around them, around touch, around penetration, sex, around all kinds of different things. What it takes to get someone fully aroused may be wildly varied in activity and
Hmm.
time if not activity, or vice versa. And and remembering that our biggest sex organ is our brain, unless you count the skin, which we probably should. So masturbation is foundational to try to just understand the parts and how they function, and what seems to be most pleasurable and what seems to need more time to build to a pleasurable kind of fruition. It's very common for people to skip the arousal part. And I think some people even do that during masturbation. Back in the 90s, there was it had to have been a hippie woman company. I don't even remember what their name was. They were based in Portland, Oregon, because of course they were. I'm from Oregon. I respect this, and I recognize. I see you, Portland, Oregon, and in the flyer for the sex toy, which was a penetrative toy, a dildo, I think, if I remember right, it said, "Make sure you want to do this." It didn't say it in so many words. I think it used a different phrase, but the you're reading a flyer about a product, and the product flyer says, "Thanks for buying our product. Are you sure you want to use this? Are you ready to?" Wow. I I I don't think I've ever seen another statement like that. I've
Mm.
looked at a lot of sex toy flyers in my day. It's one of my, sub responsibilities. But how we optimize our own experience will really help us understand how to optimize our experience if we get with another person. And let's be clear that I said if, not when. It's an
Mhm.
alternative and a very popular one, as it would appear, but it isn't a requirement, and something that our asexual spectrum friends have been telling us now for the last 15, 20 years, much more accessibly than was the case when I was coming up. I never heard that phrase. I don't know that I would have embraced it at that time, having told you about myself, but I would have been really glad to know that in some of the contexts that I experienced growing up, exploring, learning it in the gutter, some of the awkward times, were they because I was making assumptions about sexual desire in other people that weren't there? I'm not saying I was running around grabbing on people's genitals or anything like that. Generally, I didn't act that way, but in a world that pressures us to have sex, doesn't give us too many tools, especially around communication around that, in a world that people pressure to have sex often drink and drug in order to get some nerve up to do it. Now, I like a nice glass of Chardonnay or Prosecco, right? But it isn't meant to be self medication to get you out there. If you don't want to get out there, really, you don't have to go. If you're in a situation where you don't have agency, of course, that's
Mm.
me talking about Chardonnay is an insult, and I apologize to anyone who felt that it was. But the idea that all right, we're growing up. What does it mean to grow up? It means to have sex. I totally bought into that. Totally bought into that. What are we going to do if we're nervous? Well, we're going to drink. That'll help. It sure. It also doesn't make for great sex. If anybody has ever paid attention to the difference between sober sex and party sex, and I don't mean sex party sex, I mean party substance sex, it's not the same experience. And if somebody has also bought into the idea that they are supposed to use this phenomenon to gain closeness and intimacy with another person, then it's a little bit of a problem, maybe a lot of a bit of a problem, shooting ourselves in the foot, as we say in the American West, to impair ourselves that we're not connected enough with the bodily and the emotional responses of another person that we're trying to be in an intimate and pleasure-filled situation with. So I want people I want people to think about why they have sex too. I mean, that would be a when I talk to college classes, a lot of times that's how I start. We make a little chart. And people throw out the reasons. There's so many, make sure he loves me, get some money, have an orgasm. There are a lot of reasons to have sex. And if people think that there's only one or two in your own life, just think about it a little bit. You know, Is the unexamined life not worth living? I wouldn't know because I've never had an unexamined life. There may be things that I didn't examine, but I've examined plenty of others. And so I just think it's useful. It's a it's an adjunct to masturbation, honestly. It's a what am I doing here assuming with this particular part of my life experience? Do I know why I'm doing what I'm doing? Let's just explore. So in a perfect world, sex ed would set us up to have that depth of introspection about everything sex, including masturbation, or everything
Mm.
sex and identity too, because of course we live in a time where identity opportunities in terms of the discourse and acknowledgement about them are greater than maybe ever before. You know, I wasn't around in ancient Egypt. I'm not sure what we're. I could be out getting way ahead of myself with this, but that also means that more people have the opportunity to be pretty upset about the whole notion. So I just I just love a little more introspection out there. It would be great.
I think there's also the notion, especially when you're relatively young or starting to explore sexually for the first time, that the language that we use is, so have you had sex yet? Have you had sex with her? We sort of define sex as being typically, if you think about between man and woman, it's penetrative sex, penis and
Sure.
vagina, that is sex.
Yeah.
And it's almost like we get everything else out of the way, then we have the sex, as opposed to thinking about kissing and stroking and caressing and holding and touching and tasting. All those things don't need to be a build up to something. They can be sex in and of themselves. Now, so it's
And
interesting how we define sex as a society.
they're all arousal building activities for those
Yeah.
people who enjoy doing them, which is not irrelevant
Mm.
because, you know, I don't really like the term foreplay because the term
Yeah,
foreplay
exactly.
implies that there's a main event that is to
Yeah.
come. And of course, a lot of people, I well remember in college, I was sitting with my gay male roommate and my girlfriend. I was well into my sexual fluidity and diversity time, right? And my girlfriend was describing experiences she had as a teenager where she would, I'll use a scientific term, essentially cock tease
Mhm.
uh, guys. It was about sort of discovering her own sexual attractiveness and power in many ways. There was a lot going on, and she had no intention of having intercourse with anybody. I, I'm not sure if she understood yet that she was a lesbian, but she had no interest in doing that at that time. And we chatted about this, and her exact phrase, I remember it clearly, was, "And I never had to have sex with any of them." Even though she'd reached under the table, you know, in the cafe or wherever it was, and given them a hard on. And my roommate, my gay boy roommate, said in a just a I can't even describe the tone of voice he used. You know, what you described is how I have sex. And it was, you know, it was the threshold of the AIDS years. There were plenty of things that my roommate didn't feel safe doing or didn't feel ready to do or just never wanted to. And my girlfriend was like, "Oh, I didn't mean to invalidate you." But the fact is that that was one of the things that had happened. And
Mm.
once I came to San Francisco and studied as a sexologist, joined the community, explored, met people, my wonderful colleague Greta Christina, another uh, she'd be a fantastic guest for you, by the way. She was focusing on writing about sex in those days, and she's writing more about atheism and different things today. And uh, she wrote a great essay in the late '90s called "Are We Having Sex Now or What?" In which she basically did what you did in your setup question, which was try to pull the threads and then ask ourselves definitionally, why would we count all this stuff out when sometimes it's the best part of what we're experiencing together and has enough less social push to do it that that's where the creativity and the chasing the energy can really lie. I mean, I don't want to discount intercourse with your eyes open together, because that's just not like you can avoid energy if that's in your experience. It's pretty great. But I think it's so important to reinforce for people, you'll have various experiences, and some of them will turn out to be the ones that really work for you. Take that seriously. Don't think there's a standard of normalcy, because that indeed is what this penetration as definition of sex is. The standard of normalcy might be different for different people. The standard of normalcy is, in fact, far wider than most of us ever understand. And on top of that, many of us have a whole basket of things that we find really erotic to think about, even if we never get around to finding a context to do them in our lived lives. They're still part of our sexuality, right? They're still part of our sex life. If you have a worked up
I do one thing
fantasy
that's
and are masturbating, the fantasy is part of the sexual experience that you're having. It's not absent from it. It's integral to it. Doesn't mean you can't masturbate with no fantasy, although some people can't. So I get the question, what's normal? And I want to ask back, what pleases you? What do you desire? And what don't you desire? Because both things are extremely important. You know, the 3 lists technique that came out of the kink community, in which you take a piece of paper, you write yes, maybe, no on the top, couple of lines in between, and then you start listing the sex things, that the pleasure things, that are the things that you know you enjoy pretty much anytime they ever happen, that things that you just wouldn't ever want to do, or it happened once and never, never, never again. Or in lubricant, the maybe. Oh, the people are being ill behaved out there on this street. The
it's all.
maybe list is such an interesting list, because each one is contingent on something. What? What is it contingent on? Know thyself. Think about that, because it's a way for you to optimize your circumstances. And people seem to think sometimes that sex is like this swept away wave, right? Remember that there was a sexy movie in our youth called Swept Away, and that was basically the gist of it. And I'm not sure it was from the woman's point of view either, now that I think about it. That last scene on the beach was sexy, but I have had sand in my crotch before, and I don't think
Yeah, I never
filmmakers thought
really.
that through.
Mm,
Anyway, uh, in a swept away sex situation, and it isn't just, you know, someone who is penetrated who can feel that that is what is happening to them. It can be anybody who's sort of taken by arousal and doesn't stop to think about the questions that, you know, all these
mm,
various questions that we've had a chance to unearth talking to each other today. Um, Instead, it's all systems go, and then later on, you try to work out whether or not that could have happened in a different way, or whether it should have tried to have happened in a different way, or whether it was perfect the way it was, or what. I I I want to empower people to have those kinds of thoughts for themselves, because the idea that we don't have any control at all once we get into a sexual situation is fundamentally disempowering. It can be a sexy fantasy too. You know, plenty of people utilize it with the appropriate guardrails or not. as a force of arousal, inspiration, all kinds of things. But I do want us to know that those questions are there to ask, and maybe to make different decisions about, or to optimize in ways that maybe we haven't thought about before.
Mm.
Many possibilities here. Sex is not one thing. Somebody once told me, I could understand if sex was your business. I could understand if it was your hobby. But it's everything. I'm like, do you know how much we're taught? This is like, I got a PhD. This is a freaking profession. It's a worldview. It's a vast philosophy. It's not one thing. It will never be one thing. Not even under a system that would like to pick one thing and make that the only appropriate thing. We've tried that. It didn't
Mm.
work. It's not going to work this time
Yeah.
either.
There's two things I wanted to pick out of that. One is that I think the people that believe they're having sort of regular normative sex could learn a lot from the kink and BDSM community about consent. There's when they negotiate, discuss the yes, no, maybe discussion. We don't often have that in sort of normal sex, if you like. So actually, there's a lot they could learn from that community. And then the second thing is, I think if we judge our sexual identity by our ability to have penetrative sex, as men, we suffer from erectile dysfunction at times. All women, half the population go through menopause when things feel different and it's a different situation. So if all you have in your head is, well, sex is my penis and her vagina, that's what sex is, then it becomes very difficult when that isn't practical or possible, and you berate
Yeah.
yourself for not being able to have sex if you've not thought of the other things. So I do think there is definitely a state of mind and a change that comes in different phases of our life, different ages, different
Mhm.
relationships, all of those things that we should be more aware of, I think.
And good sex education would help people anticipate that too. That the notion that
Yeah.
we've sort of adopted the notion of sexual fluidity for sexual orientation questions, right?
Hmm.
That maybe you seem to start out straight, but then it seems like maybe you're going to be bi, and all of that. Eventually, you may decide you're asexual, and you just don't have that desire anymore for anyone under any circumstances. There's lots of ways it can go, and when we're surprised and when we sort of pathologize that kind of change as a society or as individuals, that doesn't do us any good. That
Mm.
this sort of change happens, and as you say, with aging and menopause in particular, it's built in. If you're lucky enough to get old enough to experience these kinds of physical changes, the likelihood is good that you will experience them, at least until you run off to a urologist or something and see if they've got anything to prescribe to you, which sometimes works fine. But the other thing is that, what does it mean to have these issues be integral to our self-image in a way that it
Mm.
that we don't just take a hit in terms of what we can do that we might want to do, which is, of course, that's a disappointment in the moment. Certainly, it's a disappointment for many people when that occurs. Although, remember, there's more sex out there, and the stories I hear of erectile dysfunction leading to just shutdown. It's like, well, at least you could work in a little sensual massage, you people. Come on, don't be touch starved too. But that's a
Yeah.
thing, of course, and I just would love to have people remember. I remember at the height of the AIDS era, I was in a safer sex and sex education nonprofit with this extraordinary man. He was a bisexual man. He was a sex surrogate partner. Not many men ever ever do that work. He was one of the first ones. And he said about safer sex and AIDS prevention, if I only have one thing that I can do that pleases me sexually, and suddenly I can't do that anymore, I'm in trouble. It's a crisis.
Yeah.
I have 129 things that please me sexually, and I have to get rid of one or maybe two of
Yeah.
them. Get rid of one, put a condom on the other one. Well, I'm still going to have a good sex life. And I'm not saying that people need to add more and more and more bells and whistles to their sex life unless that's the exploratory and play path that they're on, because for some people, um, a new toy is a grand experiment, and possibly even more so if they're partnered. Because, of course, if you add toys to a partnership, you're also learning not only how you respond to it, but how they respond to it. You're negotiating, you're keeping track of maybe what assumptions are that come along with the toy. It's a very common thing for women to come into good vibrations who have male partners and say, "Oh, I could never share this with him. I'm not even going to tell him I'm buying this." Why not? Well, it would impact his manhood to know that I was pleasuring myself. And then, of course, if you dig deeper, and it's not always polite to do this, but I have had such conversations in my time. Are you pleased now? Are you having orgasms now in your sex life? Are you getting optimally aroused? Is there a reason that's relevant to that question that you're coming in to get a vibrator? Well, yeah, not always orgasming. The orgasm gap is real, which is the notion that it's much more common for men in sexual encounters with women to have orgasms than the women. And it's more likely that same sex partners will have orgasms than other sex partners, partly because nasty, terrible sex education gives us the notion that we're opposites. And if we're opposites, well, that's the plug and socket definition of our penetration focused sex life, right? There's also some old be fruitful and multiply back in there, and in some cases very much forward, as in United States politics. But
Mm.
the other thing that it is how could I possibly understand his experience or her experience? I can't. We're so different. We hold different roles in the world. We have different bodies that don't feel the same thing, that don't do the same thing. We try to come up with some techniques and hope for the best. And I hope for the best for everyone too, of course. I want everyone who wants good sex to have good sex. I really truly do. Anything that I say that seems to the contrary is not really to the contrary. It's a step in the way that often, balls us up, but it's not true. We can transplant our organs from one to the other. We're not different species. The parts of our body that generally feel sexual pleasure, and there are many more that many people don't explore, but the junk, the parts, the pleasure parts, the genitals, develop from the same tissue in utero before the hormones hit, before any differentiation that's going to happen happens. We were the same. We looked the same. It's not different tissue. And the largest clitorises are larger than the smallest penises, and different people have different levels of hormones in their body naturally, not additively, although yay for the people who feel the need for that, and I hope that you can still get your hormones ongoingly. So why is it just this one notion when you can add to that or have a beautiful sex life apart from that at any age, including past the time when the pleasure parts are no longer giving you as much pleasure because age and in some cases ailments, or in other cases the drugs you take for your ailments,
Yeah.
have changed up what the parts do when they respond to touch. So what else will respond to touch? You know, it's not time to stop. It's time to wonder what's next in a situation like that. And too many. I just found out a couple of years ago during the pandemic, I was having a Zoom interview with someone who had just written a book about perimenopause and menopause.
Mhm.
And this person is non-binary. And so it's much less woman, 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 and which, you know, I like woman, woman, woman. I'm not gainsaying that in any way, but I'm saying that there was more opportunity to discuss different people's experience, which was useful and interesting. I'd never seen anybody do that before. And I asked, why is the information in your book so much more contemporary feeling and rich with information than the last menopause book I read? And they said, trans medicine has looked far more closely at the role of hormones than medical science had done before under
Mhm.
it for any reason. And because we need to get the hormone titer right for a trans person who is gender affirming, and for all kinds of other reasons, we have sort of inadvertently gotten a whole bunch more information about what happens during perimenopause when the hormones shift. We still don't have, there are a couple of people who have talked about hormone changes for those assigned male at birth, at midlife, and beyond. But there's not anywhere near as much discourse about that, and I think that's very interesting. You know,
Mm.
the guys aren't supposed to change. We all know the women are like, oh, pretty soon they're going to be having hot flashes. And I was in a menopause discussion with a medical doctor last week, and the MD said, oh yeah, it feels like sandpaper. It feels like you've got glass in your vagina. And I'm like, dear merciful
That's a
goddess,
nice
don't
image.
say that to your patients in the room. Oh my goodness,
Yeah.
my friend. That's a lot. That's some language. And yet, of course, it's probably been explained that way to her by some.
Mm.
And I would like all of us at every age to have the right kind of doctoring to help us be as healthy and as full in our bodies as we're able to be based on the life that we're choosing to live. It If we talked about this stuff way longer before I entered perimenopause, I might have avoided going through some experiences that I went through. I mean, you know, I'm a sexologist. I'm willing to go through all the experiences. I went through menopause without any hormone replacement therapy for one reason. They were scaring us about hormone replacement therapy when it was my time to, you know, pull a ticket. But the other reason was because I was like, what does it feel like? What is the experience? If I do HRT, I won't actually know.
Mm.
And I think that's meaningful information, but I would really like the research world to go as far with it as they're able in order to inform people clearly, which means training doctors better. Oh, menopause care in the United States is a specialty. You can't even expect your general practitioner to have had special information about it. And it may be the same in the UK. I'm not sure about that, but I certainly know that different countries have different levels of sense and nonsense when it comes to these kinds of questions. So, you know, when I talk to college students and I'm insulting their probable sex education, I say, how many of you think you had great sex education? And, you know, 3 people out of 500 might snake their hands into the air. A few of them look a little confused and they're wiggling their hand around. And then I say, look, oh, look at them. They're either Scandinavians or Unitarians. Because the Unitarian Universalist folks, I believe in the United States in collaboration with the United Church of Christ, do the best sex education in the land that isn't adult oriented, here, let's all take our pants off and figure out what's going on, a la Betty Dodson. They have our whole lives, a program that acknowledges that young people need sex ed and old people do too, and everybody in the middle does. And I will never not love them for that. That they took their um, they took their special status as a religious organization and they just said, what do the people need? Oh, okay. I think they feed people too, of course, but they
Yeah.
were the ones who stepped up. And I just want, we're talking about Unitarians, so I'll just say I pray that the medical establishment eventually will get there, because it's a little hard to get to optimization and potential pleasure when you're supposed to be fixing ills. It's
Yeah.
it's part of the history of vibrators. It's just fixing ills is so important. Preventing ills is so important.
It's really interesting that the church that offers the sort of most in terms of education also feeds people, because it's all about nourishment, really, isn't it? Nourishment of the intellect, of the soul, and of the body by sort of feeding both mind and body. It's yeah, they're really interesting. It is the same in the UK. So German practitioners have, again, they're very busy. They need to cover everything, and they
Mhm.
have which is sad in a way. They have a sort of standard pack almost that they hand out. Right, you want HRT? Right, here's the tablets, here's the patches. Right,
Yeah.
good luck. It's a bit like when you go to a doctor with depression. They'll try you on 7 or 8 different medications before it is hit and miss. And as somebody going through menopause, you don't necessarily know what to expect. Is it, like I say,
Mm.
is it normal that I feel I'm putting weight on and I'm hopefully, is that how it should be? But I think it is important, and hopefully you can validate this, that going through the menopause doesn't mean the end of your sex life. That people in
Yeah.
their 60s, 70s are having amazing sex once going through
Yeah.
menopause. So it's not an end of anything.
If I were going to tell one thing to those going through perimenopause and noticing that they're having libido challenges or arousal challenges, I would say look at the context of your sleep hygiene, because sleep is often also
Yes.
impaired. And people with impaired sleep are not having their best sex. If that gives you the impetus to, go to bed at the same time every night and do some box breathing, well, go for it, because being sleep deprived or sleep impaired is really associated with stress, and both those things are associated with a lack of pleasure of various kinds, pleasure or function, with
Mm.
sex. And maybe a doctor will tell you all of that, and maybe they won't even know it.
Yeah.
They're going to take all of the different menopausal or whatever, depression related, etc., sexually related or not, symptoms one at a time, try to prescribe a drug or something for each one, and never braid them, never understand that they're braided to begin with. And that, one of the things that, as you were talking about that, a word floated into my mind, and it's holistic.
Yes.
We've got to treat ourselves, we've got to treat our sex lives and desires and other people's, honestly, if we could get there, as though things are linked, connected, because they are. And if we try to take sex away from, say, the general tenor of communication and emotional health in a relationship, the sex doesn't thrive there. If it's problematic, if it's good, the sex probably will thrive no matter what. But if you've got issues that are based in assumptions or just stress and not regulating properly, or there's, I mean, so many ways that this can come up and impact people. And I want people not to have those experiences. I want them to be able to get the right care, the right information, the right ability to be real with their person and talk to them compassionately and clearly, help them understand differences and changes, help them understand needs and desires. Do it, with the BDSM cruise 3 lists and safe word modality, where if something's starting to happen that you don't want, you say banana split or
I go for a shorter word. But yeah.
some phrase. The mother of the safe word, Cynthia Slater, used aspidistra, which many people do not even know is a ground cover plant, but it's such a great word. And it's just hard enough to remember that if you're a dominant woman, that poor sod has to remember a word like that. Anyway, what a meanie. She was brilliant, and taking the language outside of stop it, no,
Yeah.
in that context especially was brilliant, because people might be yelling those things out of glee or because the role play they were engaging in called for it or whatever. Those of us or you or whatever who are vanilla people, and that is not an insult, it just means there are many flavors. Those people sometimes just can't bring themselves to say no in a moment that's supposed to be intimate. So pick a different word. It makes it easier. Anything that makes communication easier and more full will probably make sex better.
That was actually what I wanted to ask about next. Is the importance of communication? So I think in lots of long-term relationships, people perhaps haven't asked each other for the last 5, 10, 20 years, what do you like? Just like the same things you
Yeah.
liked 25 years
Yeah.
ago. And I think, and then when something happens, whether it be the guy can't get it up anymore, or the woman's finding it hard to sort of lubricate or whatever, it's suddenly hard to then sort of say, right, we're going to be great communicators now. Because going from sort of nothing to here is really hard. So that
Yeah.
importance of just being able to talk about things is so critical. And I think that's where sexual therapists, somatic healers, people that can come in and actually be that third party and actually help the communication is so valid. And I really wish people would seek out. And that's almost, maybe therapy is almost puts people off, but it's just, yeah, assistance, guidance, help.
Yeah.
That's what people should look to dig out, really.
I think this is another problem with the idea of normativity, that there's, like sexuality and desire, communication is a fundamental
Yeah,
human experience and a skill that we need to get by in the world, right?
yeah,
And we learn, as I learned without information from this vibe in my home when I was young, that sex was a thing that was to be considered and possibly feared. Just as I learned that without anybody telling me in so many words, you know, little kids experience how people communicate around them or don't. And,
mm,
who are they to say that this isn't how communication works? They're little kids. And I'm not talking, of course, about sexual communication. I'm talking about all the kinds of communication, and how well we can understand our own experience and convey it to another person and listen to the other person when they try to do it back. And I just want people to, whether they want sexual relationships in their life or not, to take communication seriously. And even if they don't want sexual relationships in their life, or they feel like, no, I'm not there with this, even so, they're going to have a better, healthier life if they can communicate their truth to other people. It's just, they'll have a better work experience. They'll have a better social experience. They won't get in as much trouble with their family of origin as they age and start to harden into irritation and cut each other off, and all the things that the agony ants are hearing about these days. Is like, my daughter cut me off. It's like,
Yeah.
I feel your pain. I hate to hear it. Please think back about what you said to your daughter when she hit puberty, because there are often clues right there. And by the time I hit puberty, I had a little bit of a detector. I'm sure things impacted me that I heard. I'm sure that they did.
Mhm.
But when my mother finally tried to talk to me about sex, she couldn't even get a sentence out of her mouth. She stammered. She was in such discomfort. It was awful. And I finally just said, probably snappishly because I was a teenager, "Mom, are you trying to talk to me about sex?" She was like, "Yes." I was like, "I know about it, Mom." And she said, poor, poor, poor mom, but not to her credit either, said, "Oh, good." And that
Yeah.
was the talk. So, all the people do better. We can all do better. We can all have more compassion about this stuff. And we can all realize where the gaps were for us, what we had to think, what we had to do to try to overcome them or patch them sometimes. Sometimes they are not overcome. And just understand that pretty much everybody we run into has something like that in their history, not parallel to ours exactly,
Mhm.
probably ever, usually, but something. And we've got to try to figure out how to give each other grace around that. And maybe if we could be a sexually diverse people, I mean, this is why progressives put their arms around sexual diversity issues and other diversity issues. If the people can tackle this, then we're a better polity. We can tackle more than this together with respect for who we all are. And it's I gotta say, it's a bad look when people reject that idea. It's not going to make the path easier for us. And I don't even only mean progressive people or queerdos or any of that. It makes the path more challenging. And I remember that the other things that were going on when I was a little kid and I was scoping my mother out and trying to figure her out and all of this, when a boy in my early high school years got caught cross dressing, he went away and he never came back. I'm sure they sent him to a facility. And I I Unitarian pray for him all the time. I have no idea whatever might have become of him or not him, depending on this and that. And people were being thrown in facilities for being gay. People
Yeah.
were losing their jobs. People were losing their kids. People were having constant lives of discrimination. And political activists and allies and people with empathy and compassion, including many Christians as well as non Christians, together took about 40 years, 50 years, but stepped up and changed the way we live together in the world, at least started to do that. And that tells me that if we have to, we can do it again. I don't know if I'm going to be alive to see the end of the path, and I'm not sure the path ever ends. But I do know that we are not frozen in time. We never are. We live in history. And here we are in history.
Yeah.
May you live in interesting times. They say it's a curse.
Mhm. Yeah.
But if you're going to live in interesting times, at the very least, try to understand what is going on around you. You know, it's not it's not a strategy to avoid that. It's not a success strategy. So
And maybe people don't necessarily realize that how much has changed relatively recently. It was in the 60s in the UK that homosexuality stopped being illegal.
That's right.
Illegal. And in the 50s especially, aversion therapy was considered what you did. You
Yeah.
were cured of being homosexual. And then it became not illegal, but still, obviously, you can make something not illegal, but still people were very much, very much sort of
Yeah.
suspicious.
And when we say cure, let's just spell it out. You were tormented into not
Yeah,
letting anyone notice that you might be homosexual.
yeah.
I mean, at best, pretty
Yeah,
much.
you would consider it torture these days. I mean, you may well have
Yeah.
considered it torture then, but it was
Yeah.
something that was done with the power of the state. I mean, you think we live in a
And
democracy and
and I
everything
just
else,
want to
but
say it was too late for one of the great mid-century geniuses and one of the most important historical figures in the last 150 years, Alan Turing,
yes,
was too
absolutely.
late for him. And we wouldn't be talking together, you in the UK
Yeah,
and me here, with some people probably gonna, on their phone or something, tune in later on to hear what we chatted about.
yeah,
And the freaking people who are trying to take over the internet with AI would be doing something else for a living today because Alan
literally.
Turing
Yeah,
gave us so much groundwork to develop this new way of living in the world via machines. Time will tell whether or not it was a gift or a curse. Alan, I'm
yeah,
sorry to besmirch your name that way, but I'm still not sure.
yeah,
But he got hounded to death by the
yeah.
state for these reasons. And my heart bleeds for anyone who feels in danger and is in danger right now. But between Alan Turing's death and today, there was a time where things started to change, and it can change again. I fully believe that. I was one of the first gay youth activists in the United States. My hair's gray. It's been a minute. And the things that the things that went over the waterfall in that amount of time, extraordinary. So we've always been living in extraordinary times, I think. Interesting times.
I guess we just don't want people to have to feel shame or guilt or embarrassment for not necessarily their sexuality or their gender preferences, just for wanting a particular act or believing a certain thing or whatever. You want people to feel they can be themselves, which is such a silly thing to say, but you want people ultimately to be the person they want to and desire to be. And it sounds like
It's
such a
only
simplistic thing to
silly.
say.
It's only silly that you have to say it.
Yeah,
It's not a silly notion at all. It's a pretty profound and ground level, in my opinion. But we do have to remind people that it's a good thing for people to be integrated with themselves. It's it's not it's not outrageous. It's pretty basic.
I've taken a lot of your time. Sorry, and just very very easy to talk to. Just a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Yes.
One would be, so you spend a lot of time and energy in this space, and I'm sure at times you hear an experience or traumatic experience of some other people. And how do you look after your own mental and physical well-being? How do you care for yourself?
Well, one of the ways that I do that, I just um, showed you and the listeners, which is to look back, see change, understand that any person might find themselves playing a role in
Mhm.
change of whatever kind, and to take an enormous amount of comfort in that, to know that even though my mother didn't have the opportunity for support, there is much more opportunity for support now for people who have had non-consensual, painful experiences. The
Yeah.
experiences that people are undergoing have not stopped, as unfortunately we know all too well. There is pushback against the kinds of tools that might be of use to them for a variety of reasons, some of which Margaret Atwood probably foresaw a minute
Yes.
ago. But there is more for people. And if there's anybody who's hearing our conversation who hasn't ever reached out to get any of that kind of information, there's information for you in books, there's information for you in documentaries, workshops, information online. Keep an eye out for it. It's not everything is not as good as everything else, but let's try to make it better. And therapists and support groups and learning how to communicate your truth. And some of us find we have an enormous support system in our partner and our friends. Some find we need a different support system than that. But it's full of hope, even if it's a hard path to get started on. The culture in its problematic decisions and its accretions has made it hard. But that doesn't mean that many people haven't successfully walked it. And everyone who hears my words right now can do that, at least to some degree. For whatever, every step counts. Every little step counts. So those are things. You may have noticed that I have cats. My feline brothers give me a lot of support. I have a partner who is on this path with me to see what kinds of gifts and other things the world's given us around sexuality and diversity, and trying to optimize the gift part and make that available to more people. Whatever. And let me just spell out, I don't just mean go party down, get a lot of sex toys, hang from the chandelier. If you're going to do that, make sure the chandelier is
It's
stable. Think of your safety, people, but also the country mice in their little burrow who are mated for life and are just there together can have extraordinary experiences in their burrow. It is possible for any of us. And for some of us, it will take some healing to get to the real possibility. But the possibility of healing is such a positive. So I just stay there as much as possible. I try real hard not to catastrophize. I think you probably can tell from talking to me that I try to look into things as well as I'm able. It's my life strategy. I grew up with probably a neurodivergent brain. I grew up in a time when I could find a different way of living my life, and I know what a gift both of those things are, and I know that they can be detriments in some ways, especially when times change like this. So if I catastrophize, I just run around in circles in a
yeah.
panic for as long as I have the energy to do that. And that's not a good place. And I have a few tools. I put my hand on a cat. I breathe. I remember that boy who went away, or delightful child who went away, and hope that we are going to be able to create a world together where that doesn't happen anymore. And so underneath, I think there's a I think there's a little warrior spirit in me, but I try to make sure that it is um, pretty positive in terms of what I believe we can achieve. Because if I don't believe that, it disempowers the warrior and it makes the warrior mad. I don't know if you want that. That if that's the case, I'm just holding on to it until it's really, really needed. And we're on the brink now. And people all over the US, people all over Europe, people over the world are writing down some clever or some infuriated protest signs on backs of cardboards and showing up. And it's wonderful to live in a complicated world where that can happen. Wonderful. Maybe we'll live in a world someday where it never has to. But that's why history is an arc, right? Or a spiral, or whatever it is.
I can't think of a better place to end. Thank you so much. You've been so informative, gracious, humorous, intelligent, and pick any adjective you want, but all the good ones. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm lucky that I came into a world where I didn't have to be one way. And all of us live in that world if we could get out of where we are thinking that we have to be one way. So I just wish that for everyone. And I am so grateful to you for your wonderful statements and questions. And I very much enjoyed talking to you. So I hope that your listeners also find that this is interesting and useful for them.